Hello dear friends, this is your personal English coach, Professor DC here, and in this video we will be understanding a story known as The Story of an Hour, written by Kate Chopin. Kate Chopin was an American author and a novelist, and she was based out of Louisiana. Let's see what this story has to offer. On my screen you can see the story on the left side with meanings of its difficult words on its right to make it very easier for you to understand. Let's begin with the story. The first sentence. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. We get a lot of information from this sentence itself. Number one, we are introduced to a character, Mrs. Mallard, a married lady who is suffering from heart ailments, heart trouble, heart disease. Perhaps she would have gotten heart attacks in the past. It is not disclosed yet. But we also get to know that Mrs. Mallard's husband, as people assume, is dead, and Mrs. Mallard isn't aware of this news yet. And the person who was responsible for breaking the news or telling the news to Mrs. Mallard had to be very careful. Why? Because if the person just broke the news just like that, it is fairly possible that Mrs. Mallard succumbs to a heart attack. So the person who's responsible for disclosing this sad news had to be very gentle and very slow in telling her that Mrs. Mallard's husband is no more. Moving on. It was her sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that reveal in half concealing. The meaning of veiled is to cover with or to hide, and to conceal also means to hide. So both these words are more or less having the same meanings. So Mrs. Mallard's sister is also in the scene. Her name is Josephine. She was aware that Mrs. Mallard is suffering from heart trouble. So very gently she started giving her hints. She started framing sentence something like, "Dear sister, please keep yourself strong. Please do not be worried for the news that I'm about to disclose." So, trying to be as gentle as possible, Josephine revealed Mrs. Mallard that her husband was no more. She gave clues and hints. She didn't break the news all of a sudden. Next sentence. Her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received. So here we can assume that there has been an accident on the railway tracks. Now, which type of incident hasn't been revealed? Did the train go out of its tracks? Was someone standing on the railway tracks as an obstruction? Nothing of that sort has been revealed. But all we know is there has been a railroad disaster, an accident on the railway tracks, and this is the very reason of Mrs. Mallard's husband's death, according to people, according to the news. Whenever this disaster, this accident unfolded, Mrs. Mallard's husband's friend, who's called by the name of Richards, was in the newspaper office. And how do these reporters get news? It is from the intelligence, it's from the sources that are present during the time of the event. So, from the intelligence, Richards, who was in the newspaper office, got to know that Mrs. Mallard's husband was no more. Apparently, the newspaper office had received a paper in which there was this list of people who were killed in this railroad disaster, and Brently Mallard's name was under killed. So amongst the people who were killed in this disaster, Mrs. Mallard's husband, and now we know the name here, Brently Mallard, was killed. Now this information was received by Richards, who was in the newspaper office, and as it was sent by the intelligence by the reporters who were there during the scene, Richards was very sure that Brently would have been killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram. So when Richards got to know that his best friend Mr. Mallard is no more, did he get convinced quickly? Did he believe it quickly? No. In those days, people used to send telegrams, and yes, it was only after the second telegram was received with the list of people who were killed that Richards was convinced that Brently Mallard, who is Mrs. Mallard's husband, is killed. Now this information had to be passed on to Mr. Mallard's family. So the meaning of hastened is to be quick to do something. In English, they say haste is waste. Forestall is to prevent. So what is the meaning of this sentence here? Hasten to forestall any less careful, less tender friend. So any person who was not really careful, who was not really tender, was prevented by Richards to broadcast this message to his family. Richard would stop anyone or any friend who he believed is not tender, is not caring, and only the person who is careful, tender, and understanding, sensitive was sent to Mr. Mallard's home for breaking this message around. Moving on. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. So, did Mrs. Mallard hear the story just like other women? What would other women do if they are told about the news of their husband's deaths? They would not understand the significance. They would get paralyzed. Let's check out the meaning of paralyzed. Paralyzed is to go numb when you do not feel anything. It is called being paralyzed. So when other women are told about such a saddening event, when other women are told about their husband's death, they become numb. They do not accept the fact. But here, Mrs. Mallard did not react that way, did not react like other women. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. What is the meaning of abandonment? It is to cease to support or to look after, to desert. If you want, you can pause my video and keep writing the meanings in your textbooks. So how did Mrs. Mallard react when she got the news of her husband's death? All of a sudden she started crying with wild abandonment, means as if somebody left her completely. Somebody left her lonely and deserted in this life. She felt abandoned, she felt alone, and therefore all of a sudden she cried. She hugged her sister, and in her arms she wept. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. So she got the news, she cried and cried. There was so much sadness, there was so much grief when she learned that her better half is no more. And when this feeling had subsided a little bit, metaphorically speaking, when the storm of grief had spent itself, which means after she had cried and cried and cried as much as she could, she needed some space to be alone. She wanted some alone time, and she asked everybody around her not to follow her when she is going inside her room. She said, "Do not follow me. Please do not follow me. I need some time alone." There stood facing the open window a comfortable, roomy armchair. Inside the room in which Mrs. Mallard admitted herself, what was there? There was a nice armchair wherein you can sit and relax yourself. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. This line is very deep. Into this she sank. Into what she sank? Into the armchair. She sank means she sat. So she sat in this armchair, pressed down by physical exhaustion. Now, was there a person pressing her down? No, it was her own physical exhaustion, tiredness, that made her sit down with a thud into that armchair. Her body was so tired, and this tiredness, this exhaustion, it seemed as if it is reaching her soul. Now, what is the meaning of exhaustion reaching one's soul? It just means that she was completely exhausted and tired. Number one, because of her heart ailments. Number two, because of the sad news. Number three, because of the crying, because of the grief that she expressed and that she thought about. It looked as if she was completely tired. She was shattered. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. Let's check out the meaning of aquiver. Aquiver is to tremble. So, as soon as she sat on her armchair, which was inside her room, on the wall there was a little window, a square-shaped window, from which, what was she seeing? She could see the tops of the trees trembling, which means moving here and there because of the breeze, because of the air, and she was gazing at them. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. Now we already know how it feels when we have the first rain. The sweet fragrance of rainfall delights us so much. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. So what is a peddler? It's a person who sells illegal drugs or stolen goods. Well, here we can just assume that there's a person who's selling items and was crying his wares. W-A-R-E-S. What is the meaning of wares? Articles offered for sale. So now the whole environment is described. Mrs. Mallard sat down into her armchair and she was gazing at a small window from which she could see the tops of the trees. And what else was there? There was this fresh air of the rain, nice smell of the rain was there in the air. And what was heard? What else was heard? There was this guy who was selling some stuff near the street, and he was crying out so that people can hear him sell his goods. The notes of distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly. So it looks like there was also a person who was singing a song, and the notes of the song was heard from a distance. It reached Mrs. Mallard. Not completely, but a little bit. That's why they said faintly. What's the meaning of faintly? Slightly, vaguely, right? And what else? Countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. So what is the meaning of eaves? Part of a roof that meets over the wall, or we can say part of the roof that meets or overhangs the walls of a building. So there was an area of a building where there were lots of sparrows and they were twittering, they were singing cheerfully. So a couple of entities mentioned so that we get a nice picture, a nice idea of the atmosphere where Mrs. Mallard settled herself in grief. What else? There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west, facing her window. Now, how can there be patches of blue sky showing here and there? Now, patch is a mark or a straight line or a straight mark, you can say. So when there are clouds, what do you see? You see a little bit of blue sky and a little bit of clouds, and looks as if the clouds were scattered here and there, as they usually are, and the clouds had met and they were also piled upon one another. So a nice description written of the sky and the clouds, and all of that was in the west, facing her window. So we get to know from this line that the window was facing the west direction. So let's go back and see the different parameters in the atmosphere. Number 1 is the treetops. Number 2 is the peddler selling his items. Number 3 was somebody singing a song. Number 4 is sparrows twittering. Number 5 is blue skies. And number 6 is window facing the west. So what happens after that? I hope I did not miss out any meanings. If I did, please make sure you ask me in the comment section. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. So, when you are in distress, when you are sad, when you are shattered, and when you have settled yourself in a chair or on a sofa, usually your back of the head touches the surface of your chair or sofa, whichever medium you are settled in. So similarly, Mrs. Mallard, now she had cried as much as she could, and the exhaustion had swallowed her. She could not believe this. She was thinking, what happened? She was thinking, how am I so abandoned? Why is all of this happening to me? And we already know that she had cried as much as she could, so she was still sobbing, right? When somebody has cried so much, there is this unintentional sob that comes up and settles down, right? After a while when you have cried. So similarly, she did not move, quite motionless. She was stand still in deep thoughts, thinking about life, thinking about her husband. She would only move when this little sob came up to her throat and shook her. And this is compared with a child who is in the need of something. It cries and cries and cries and cries until it gets tired, and then it falls asleep gradually. But what happens when the child is sleeping? The sobbing continues. This is unintentional, unconscious activity. So, just like a child who continues to sob unconsciously, Mrs. Mallard was in the same situation. Let's move on. She was young with fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. Let's check out some meanings here. What's the meaning of bespoke? Made for a particular customer or a user. Repression is nothing but crushing. So here we get to know that Mrs. Mallard was not an old lady in her 80s. She was young and she had a fair complexion, and with a very nice and serene, patient face, and the lines on her face showed that she has a little bit of stress. She is sad, and at the same time she also carried certain strength. So from her face itself you can make out that this lady is calm and patient, but she also has some strength and some sadness or stress in it. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. So what is the meaning of gaze? Gaze is to look. It's a very common word, right? And what is the meaning of yonder? Yonder is also a word widely used in Chief Seattle's speech, if you have read it. Yonder is over there, right? It's a traditional English. So when you are abandoned, when somebody has left you alone, how do you feel? Well, you settle yourself in a lonely place and keep staring at one thing. So similar was the situation of Mrs. Mallard, right? There was this dull look in her eyes, and her eyes were fixed somewhere far away on one of those patch of the blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. So there are two situations wherein you sit like this and stare. Either when you are thinking something very deeply, when you're having intelligent thoughts, that's one occasion, and otherwise when you are shattered, when you are completely sad, and when you're trying to reflect upon certain things. That's the third situation, when you're trying to reflect what has happened with you. So in this case, in the case of Mrs. Mallard, it was not reflection. She was not reflecting on what's going on in her life, but she looked as if she is out of all the intelligent thoughts, meaning she doesn't have anything logical to think of. She cannot be rational anymore after what she had heard. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. We read in the previous paragraphs how Mrs. Mallard came all alone inside a room, and she insisted nobody should follow her. She was all alone sitting inside a room and thinking. She was thinking about all the years that she spent with Mr. Mallard. She was thinking about how he treated her. She was thinking about the fact whether the time spent with Mr. Mallard was great or not. She was also thinking about the fact that whether Mr. Mallard really loved her or not. So all of this was experienced by Mrs. Mallard, and instead of feeling depressed, stressed, or sad, or shattered, she was now feeling something different. What was that feeling? She should not be feeling like this. So let's move on. It's written, what was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. So what is subtle? Subtle is something that you cannot recognize easily, and elusive comes from the word elude, which means difficult to catch. So this particular feeling, which was born in the mind of Mrs. Mallard, was very difficult to identify. She was struggling hard to decide what sort of feeling had born inside her when she was all alone and introspecting or reflecting on the years that passed or the years that spent with Mr. Mallard. But she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching towards her through the sounds, through the scents, the color that filled the air. So you see, sometimes in your lives, when you are being treated well, everything around you looks good. And at the same time, when somebody treats you badly, everything around you looks bad. So here, the sentence is actually metaphorical because feelings cannot come out of the skies, or it cannot come out of the sounds or the scent, right? But it can only come out of your own mind when you have thought about something for a long time, and then if the result of those thoughts is good, you start feeling good. If it is bad, you start feeling bad. So here in the last sentence, what the author means is she introspected and reflected about all the years that she spent with Mr. Mallard, and some different sort of feeling had born. Some strange feeling was starting to pop up inside Mrs. Mallard's mind. What was it? Still, she could not identify. And after that, her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. What is the meaning of bosom? Bosom is usually referred to a woman's chest. You want to write down the meanings? Tumultuously is in confusion, right? So now Mrs. Mallard came inside the room shattered and depressed, and after some time she was now feeling something different. Obviously it was not depression or anxiety or sadness, but she could not identify the feeling, and therefore being confused, being utterly confused about the feeling, she started breathing rapidly. And because of the same reason, her chest would rise and fell. It would rise and fall tumultuously in confusion. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will. Now, were there souls inside the room that would possess her? No, it's a feeling. So this feeling was automatically trying to conquer Mrs. Mallard. In other words, this feeling which was born inside Mrs. Mallard was completely natural, and after whatever had happened with her, this feeling was bound to come no matter how much Mrs. Mallard tried to resist it. And that is what the next sentence is. She was trying to resist this feeling with all her will. And how was her will? How was her willpower? As powerless as her two white, slender hands that would have been. Now, what is the meaning of slender? Slender is slim. Here, the author means that Mrs. Mallard's hands were weak, and same was a willpower. His willpower was also equally weak. So she was trying to resist this feeling, but still, somehow, she felt that feeling very strongly. Despite resisting, she felt that strongly now. And if we go through the next set of lines, we will easily identify what feeling it was. Let's read through. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. So when she abandoned herself, which means she gave in, she was not resisting that feeling anymore. She got surrendered to that feeling. Or in other words, we can say that the feeling naturally was intense. And what did she do? She started repeating these words. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. So, what does this mean? Let's try to understand these lines and the previous paragraph. So, as I said, Mrs. Mallard was introspecting and reflecting on the years that were spent with Mr. Mallard. And when somebody dies, we try to think if that person treated you well. And here in this case of Mrs. Mallard, Mr. Mallard never treated her with love, never treated her with respect, never cared for her, never paid attention to her, never gave time to her. And she in her room, she was, as we know, lonely and isolated, and she was just thinking about all this, thinking about how she was being treated by her husband. And eventually she concluded that she was never treated well by her husband. Her husband was controlling. He would tell her what to do and what not to do. He would always hate her. He would never care for her. He would never spend time with her. And as a conclusion, Mrs. Mallard was now thinking, or had started thinking, that now she is absolutely free. So what was that feeling that this paragraph is constantly referring to? It is freedom from being slave to a person who never cared, freedom from regulation, freedom from somebody's attention with whom you have to stay with constantly or spend your life with. So, with her parted lips, her lips were slightly open, and she started whispering to herself, "Free, I am free now, I am completely free." The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. So, in the previous paragraph, we saw how she sank into the armchair and she was staring at a couple of things without any intelligence. She was just staring, but it did not mean anything. It was a vacant stare. And when she had entered the room, her face was completely pale and terrorized after what she had heard. So now all of that went away after a lot of reflection and introspection, and now she was feeling free. And because of that, her eyes started becoming keen and bright. Why were Mrs. Mallard's eyes keen? Because she was now looking at the future which is free from bondage with another person who never cared. Her pulses beat fast and coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. So what is the meaning of coursing? When you cannot stop something, you call it coursing, coursing. And anyway, can the blood flow be stopped? It cannot be, especially when the heart is beating faster. Your blood is also flowing faster to all of your organs. So when she reflected about the years, about the time that she spent with Mr. Mallard, she thought, I was such a slave. I was wasting my time. And now that he's gone, I'm completely free. So this feeling made her feel great, and therefore her heart beats faster and the blood flows faster, and that made her warm and relaxed. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. Let's note down the meanings of difficult word. Monstrous is ugly. Exalted is glorious. Dismiss is to send away. Trivial is unimportant. Now these lines are very interesting. When we feel awesome, sometimes in our lives we feel great, we feel awesome. So here Mrs. Mallard was also feeling awesome. Now she was feeling free from the bondage. She was feeling great. She was feeling relaxed. And she did not stop to ask, meaning she did not question herself whether the joy that she felt was small or big. A clear and exalted perception. What is exalted? It is glorious. What is perception? The ability to see things, the ability to understand or perceive things is called perception. So she could see the future. She could see that now, as I'm free, I can do whatever I want. I can be myself. So that vision and those feelings enabled her to just dismiss or stop her from thinking about the fact whether the joy that she was feeling was small or big, because the vision, the future that she was seeing for herself was bigger than deciding whether the happiness was small or monstrous. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her. I believe there's some sentence and some mistakes here, but let's move on. Fixed and grey and dead. So when she was sitting in a room all alone, she started thinking about the events that would unfold from that moment on. So first thing she thought is, very soon my husband's dead body would come to my house and I would look at the dead body and I would cry because I've stayed with that person. It's a dead body, so I will definitely cry. I will have to suppress my feeling of freedom or joy because I'm gonna face a dead body, and therefore I will naturally feel like crying because I've stayed with that person no matter how bad he was. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. Which means after this sad moment, after the body has come, after she has cried, after everybody has consoled her on that single day, one single day, the days after that moment, the days after all the processes are done, the dead body is buried and everything is over, the rituals are over, she could see that she can live however she wanted. Nobody was there to tell her what she has to do, how she has to dress up, etc. etc. She can be herself. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. So after foreseeing the future, after having a vision of single and happy future, she spread her arms and she welcomed those days. She thought, welcome my dear future. I can see that I am alone and happy and free. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. So now she thought, now that my husband is dead and now that I'm free from any bondage or regulation, I can live however I want. There's nobody to tell me what I should do or how I should do, and Mrs. Mallard was completely happy about that. There would be no powerful will bending hers in the blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So to understand this sentence, let's take the second half of this sentence. To have a right to impose a private will. Now let's understand, what is this will? Will is desire, a wish, right? Private will means private desire, means if I say my private will, it means my own desire upon a fellow creature. Means if I impose my private will upon a fellow creature, that means I am forcing somebody to do whatever I wish him or her to do. Imposing something on another human being. I'm imposing something. For example, if I want my wife to only eat healthy food, I will impose that on her. I would say you just have to eat what I tell you to eat. Now that is imposing private will on somebody else. Now let's understand the first sentence. There would be no powerful will bending hers, which means there'll be no human being who would impose his private wish, his own desire onto Mrs. Mallard. So, in other words, there'll be nobody left after Mr. Mallard that would tell Mrs. Mallard what to do. And what about this word blind persistence? Persistence is determination. Blind determination. So, it is said that after marriage, the men and the women have blind determination, which means they are very sure that the other person, my better half, would do exactly as I say. I can impose anything on him or her. So that sort of blind determination was gone after the death of Mr. Mallard. So there is no human being that would tell Mrs. Mallard what to do. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. So she realized that whether it was a kind intention or a cruel intention, one should not impose his desire on another person, especially if you're married. A woman should not impose his desire on a man, and a man should not do the same with the women. She realized that imposing was a crime. Now, what does it mean by illumination here? It means light. The moment of realization is the moment of illumination. So, you see, Mrs. Mallard is sitting all alone, reflecting on the years that passed by with Mr. Mallard, and she is concluding some things here. Let's see what went on with him and Mrs. Mallard. And yet she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? So this sentence shows how her relationship was with Mr. Mallard. It was like on and off. She would love him, sometimes she would not love him. And now she's thinking, how did it matter? She said, why should I think about love, and why should I think about whether it was fair or not? She said, now nobody could impose his will on me. I can self-assert, which means I can decide what I should do in my life. She also realized the impulse of her being. She felt that now, from this point on, after my husband's death, my life is making some sense now. And with all these realizations and feelings, she whispered again all alone inside her room, free, body and soul, free. She kept whispering. Now, in the meantime, what's going on outside this room? Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Who was Josephine again? Josephine was Mrs. Mallard's sister. Let's check out the meaning of imploring. Imploring is begging, right? So, we know that Mrs. Mallard, when she got inside her room, she was shattered and depressed, and she wanted some time alone. Not because she wanted to reflect. The reflection happened because of the environment. But she wanted some time alone after a lot of crying, and therefore she asked Josephine or Richards or whoever people they were in the moment not to follow her. Josephine was tensed outside the room. She was kneeling before the closed door as this keyhole from where you insert the key and open the door, right? And from the keyhole, Josephine was constantly begging to Mrs. Mallard to come in. Louis, open the door, I beg. Open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louis? For heaven's sake, open the door. Now, this is completely ironical. Josephine was thinking that Mrs. Mallard, now we got to know the name here, it was Louis Mallard, who was married to Mr. Mallard. We're getting to know some more and more information here. Josephine is thinking that Mrs. Mallard would drive herself crazy. She is a heart patient. If she thinks more, she might get a heart attack. So she's begging from outside the room that she should immediately open the door or she will make herself ill. But what was actually going on inside? Inside, Mrs. Mallard was feeling liberated. She was actually getting better from her ill health. Now, nobody knew that. So Josephine was begging, and inside, Mrs. Mallard replied, "Go away. I'm not making myself ill." So, friends, you and I know how she was feeling, right? So it's written, no, she was drinking the very elixir. What is the meaning of elixir? It means a magical or medicinal potion. She was drinking a liquid which would make her immortal, right? What is the opposite of elixir? It is poison, right? So she was drinking the nectar. What is the meaning of this line here? Drinking in a very elixir of life. It means she had realized something which would make her even stronger. You never know. The heart attacks would have been a result of Mr. Mallard being dominant, or Mr. Mallard never caring for her. And now that Mr. Mallard was non-existent, or Mr. Mallard had died, she was getting better. So this was just the first moment she realized that she would be better than ever before. So therefore the author has written, She was drinking the elixir of life through that open window. So we had already seen how this author has put the emergence of feeling of freedom, right? She has written how the skies and the scent in the air and everything around, even the trees, they were responsible for creating this feeling. But was that the case? No, she was actually introspecting. She was actually reflecting, and all of that made her realize that the years that she spent with Mr. Mallard were actually waste. So when Josephine was begging her to open the door and to allow them inside, she said, "Go away. I'm not actually driving myself crazy. I'm not making myself ill." Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her. So now her heart was not beating faster because she thought she would be abandoned or alone or deserted without Mr. Mallard, but in fact, she was driving herself crazy thinking about her amazing future without that person. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She was thinking whether it is any season, I would be able to live the way I want, not as the way Mr. Mallard always wanted her to live. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. She said, "Dear God, now that I'm free, now that I'm not a slave of anyone's wishes or desires, please increase my life. I'm so happy." It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. What is the meaning of shudder? Shudder is tremble. So sometimes life gives you early signals, and if we identify them correctly, then they turn out to be true. So just yesterday, Mrs. Mallard had thought that something might happen because of which my life would increase. Now, she didn't realize what would happen, but at this moment, after realization, she is wanting to live more and more and more. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. Another word that you should learn. What is importunities? Persistence, especially to the point of annoyance. So Josephine was thinking that Mrs. Mallard would drive herself crazy. She might get a heart attack. So she was constantly shouting, "Please open the door. Please let me in." Now, because of all this begging, Mrs. Mallard got annoyed and irritated, and finally she opened the door. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. What is unwittingly? Without knowing. Interesting words the author has used. Feverish triumph. So she was victorious looking at the future, but she was feverish looking at the past. So that was her look on her face, and unknowingly she carried herself like the goddess of victory. Now she is the ultimate winner. Nobody could tell her what to do. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. What is clasped? Grasp something tightly with one's hand. So she actually caught her sister's waist and she went down with her, and Mr. Mallard's best friend Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. He was waiting and he was anxious as to what might be going on in Mrs. Mallard's mind. Someone was opening the front door with a latch key. It was Brently Mallard who entered, a little travel-stained. So this is the twist in the whole story. You must be thinking, Brently Mallard, hold on a second. Wasn't he Mrs. Mallard's husband who was already dead in the beginning of the story? Yes, but here this person has a key, his house key with which he's opening the door. So he opened the door with the latch key, and how did he look? He looked a little travel strained, little bit stressed from travel. Maybe he went somewhere and he was little stained, means little marks of the medium through which he traveled. Composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. Composedly means No sign of panic. He was calm and composed. He was in his shape and he was carrying his sack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident, did not even know there had been one. So, what is the twist of the story? The intelligence gave a list of the people killed to the newspaper company where Richards was present, and he double checked that list to see if Mr. Mallard was one of them. But was the intelligence true? Were the facts true? No, they were not, because Brently Mallard was not even there on the train. So how can he die? So the intelligence report was completely wrong. Brently Mallard was far away from the accident scene and he did not even know that such mishap had happened. Now he stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry. So now whatever we read happens in a quick succession, okay? So far whatever we have read is happening gradually, slowly, like breaking the news to Mrs. Mallard by Josephine in bits and pieces, and then her getting inside the room, realizing, coming out. All of this is slow, but whatever's happening after this moment is fast. Okay, there's a person opening the door with a latchkey, right? There's Richard looking up the stairs from where Mrs. Mallard and Josephine were descending, and he's opening the door. The door was open now, and he is calm and composed, holding his things, little travel strained, not at all tired, not at all panicked, and he's shocked and surprised. Why is my wife's sister crying so loudly? Piercing his sharp cry. Why is she crying so sharply? And Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. So two incidents shocked Mr. Mallard. One is Josephine's sharp cry. Second is the fact that Richard was screening him, was blocking him to be seen by his wife. Now, why was that? Why was this man, my best friend Richard, blocking me like this? Why is he blocking my view? Was the question Mr. Mallard constantly thought. But Richards was too late. And why was he late? When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. So the ending is pretty interesting here. Let's try and understand it deeply. Richard was smartly blocking Mr. Mallard's view from his wife so that looking at Mr. Mallard, Mrs. Mallard would not feel the shock, would not be overwhelmed or overjoyed so much that she gets an heart attack. This was Richard's intention. He would block Mr. Mallard so that he is not seen by his wife, who might die of a heart attack out of joy. But while she was descending, she already had got a heart attack. When the doctors came, she said she died of a heart disease, and this is when the heart stops beating out of a lot of joy. So Mrs. Mallard died because she saw her husband, and people thought that because she saw her husband alive, that's why she was overjoyed, and that's why she had a heart attack. That's what the doctors said as well. But what is the irony here? She died because all her dreams of living alone without any imposition, without any dominance, were shattered, and that was the actual reason why she got a heart attack. So how can we summarize this chapter? It's a very interesting chapter with a very interesting ending. The story of an hour begins with the news of Mr. Mallard's death in a railroad accident, which has to be broadcasted at his house, especially to Mrs. Mallard, who has been a heart patient. And Josephine is chosen to tell her the news by giving hints and clues slowly and gradually in order to make sure that she doesn't die of a heart attack. After a lot of crying, after showing a lot of grief, she admits herself into her personal space, personal room, and asking everyone not to follow her. Now, where she's sitting in her armchair, surrounded by trees and great atmosphere, scent of rain, sparrows, etc., etc., she realizes that she is completely free out of the bondage and imposition of her better half, Mr. Mallard, and she is overjoyed. She is drinking the nectar of life, and she's also thinking about the future years that she would be spending. All the seasons are hers. There's nobody on this universe that would dominate her, so she is completely overjoyed. Now, on the other side, Josephine from the keyhole is begging to Mrs. Mallard to open the door, and being annoyed, she opens the door and confirms that she is not at all upset. Now, she grabs Josephine's waist and she descends the stairs, and on the other side, behind where Richard is waiting, Richard is observing. There is this main door from where people enter, and the door is seen opening by someone, by the latchkey, and that is none other than Mr. Mallard himself. And Richard understands the situation and tries to hide him from the view of his wife. Even Josephine does that. But before they could hide Mr. Mallard, her wife is able to see him, and she dies of heart attack because all of her dreams of being alone and being free spirit like a free bird are shattered, and therefore she gets a heart attack. And when the doctors came, they said she died of a heart disease, probably because she saw her husband, who she thought was dead, actually not dead. Friends, I hope you understood this chapter. If you still did not understand, if you have issues, yes, I'm always reachable through the comment section and my email, that is iwritermailid@gmail.com. Do send me your questions and doubts and queries, and I will definitely try to clear them. I thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.